Okay, thank you all for being here and welcome to our side event about a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. Today we will talk about a clean, healthy and sustainable environment for future generations specifically. Because currently more people are dying from air pollution compared to smoking, according to the WHO. And in line with SDG 3 and SDG 11, we need to ensure and promote healthy lives, cities, and well-being for all at all ages. That is why we are here today to discuss how we can do this. This side event will delve deeper into a human rights approach to examine what kind of framework we need to guide policy formulation that not only ensures environmental sustainability, but also honors the rights of and well-being of present and future generations. So to kickstart this side event, we will watch a video statement by Alejandro. Alejandro has mobilized over 2,000 young people in Colombia through campaigns, civil spaces and dialogues. And since 2020, Alejandro has worked as a UNICEF consultant focusing on clean air specifically and youth engagement. So now we will watch a video statement by Alejandro.
Hello everyone, greetings at COP28. My name is Alejandro Dali and I'm a clean air activist from Venezuela/Colombia. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there. It's been a journey seeing everything that is happening at COP from far away. But I really wanted to give this message because as you all are, I'm also very committed to make sure that we advance on the clean air and the climate action agenda. So thank you first for coming to this gathering, to this event, and let me share some thoughts to start this conversation on why is it so important to talk about clean air. Nowadays, more than 9 million people die of diseases related to air pollution. In my case, in Latin America, more than 130 million children under 5 years old breathe air so polluted that it risks their health and development. And specifically in my country of Colombia, every 15 minutes, one person dies of diseases related to air pollution. Air pollution, which is mostly caused by the burning of fossil fuels, causes air pollutants that damage our lungs and can cause lung cancer and other respiratory diseases. It is fundamental when we're talking about climate action to understand that this impact disproportionately affects women, low-income communities, migrants, and Black and people of color. That's why talking about clean air is talking about climate justice. And it is fundamental that here together we start to shape the narrative and the conversation. So let me give you some examples of the way we have done that. Through our advocacy school, New Airs, the first advocacy school for clean air in Latin America, we have trained over 500 young children and young people in Latin America to use low-cost sensors to monitor air pollution, but also to mobilize at their school, at the community level, at the city, to advance public policy across all levels, but also to shape narratives in the local media. For example, we teach children how to use cotton to create small lawns that they place in front of their schools so they can see a change because of pollutions in the color of the lawns, from white to darker to gray. For example, when we have an alert of an air pollution contingency, we raise a red flag based on the colors of the air quality index to tell everyone in the community that the air pollution that day is harmful and we should avoid to do activities outside. But we also influence public policies, and we have created, for example, the first roundtable with young people to advance the local action plan for clean air in Bogotá, Medellín, and Cúcuta. So, my takeaway for you before you start this panel is to start this conversation with one big premise. The climate crisis is a public health crisis, and we cannot stop the movement that is already growing at COP with the first health day ever. On the contrary, we need to bring more people from the health sector. We need to bring more people, more physicians, more doctors, everyone involved to make sure that the climate agenda also involves the public health agenda. And we count on you. We call on everybody to make sure that this happens. And we remember that there's not going to be any net zero without debt zero. Thank you.
Okay, so unfortunately Alejandro couldn't be here today at COP, but I really want to thank him for this video statement. I met Alejandro last year, and he also contributed to our side event about clean air. And he is within his communities within Latin America. He is working really, really hard, well, to strive for a better environment and to make the lives of people healthier. So I think he did a great job by delivering this statement, and well, I think it's a very good start to start this panel discussion as well, because we are today with 4 panelists, and I'm gonna quickly introduce you first. So here at the left side, we have Fabian de Vries. He is responsible for the public affairs at the Youth Climate Coalition in the Netherlands. Then we have Rebecca, and she works at WECF, and she is a campaigner, right? Then we have Marta Schaaf, and Marta Schaaf is a director of Climate, Economic and Social Justice and Corporate Accountability Program for Amnesty International. And last but not least, we have Cecilia Anderson. She is a Program Management Officer at UN Habitat. So welcome you all, and welcome to this panel. So today we will talk about a clean, healthy environment and the climate justice behind it, especially focusing on air pollution, because as Alejandro has mentioned, the climate crisis is actually also a global health crisis. So starting with Rebecca, maybe, to set the scene a bit, because Alejandro also mentioned women. So what do you, from your perspective, what do you want to contribute to this discussion, and what are the challenges that you flag within this well, nexus between global health and climate change?
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you so much. And I was very thrilled that women were already mentioned in this video, because too often that's like a first group to kind of fall behind in this discussion. Women and girls and all their diversity, but also gender is a bigger topic, right? Gender does not equate women only, it's broader than that. And so I work for Women Engaged for a Common Future, and we are an ecofeminist network organization, which means that we work with global partners to tackle a lot of the issues that we're talking about. So ranging from health issues, climate, environmental issues, and really focusing on how all of these need a holistic approach. So basically that holistic approach is also what I'll be looking for in this discussion. And also showcasing, I think, some of the local examples and local initiatives that we work with, not just from WCF's end, but definitely, particularly also from the partners that we work with that do incredible work on this topic.
Yeah, thank you. And well, we're already in week 2 of COP, so you have been here for a while a bit, and if you look at the UNFCCC process, what do we still need to improve within the UNFCCC to forecast this, basically?
A lot. I think we see that obviously a lot of discussions around gender often get very politicized, and it's something that is crossed out in a lot of negotiations, which is of course a big shame. On the health side of things, it's really good that that connection is now made at COP with the first health day. Great progress. And I was at the Ministerial Conference on Environment and Health in Budapest, where then again they had climate as like a big topic also kind of for the first time. So bridging those gaps and like really showcasing how they're all interconnected, and again, I'm going to keep repeating this word, but a holistic approach to that, I think is crucial. And also seeing that within the UNFCCC processes, that you can't put gender just in a gender action plan. It needs to be in all of the negotiation streams.
Yes, okay. And Marta, if we can move on to your expertise, how do you look at this? How do you look at the nexus between human rights and the global health crisis, but also the nexus between human rights and climate change? How would you approach that from your perspective at Amnesty International?
Yeah, thank you. Alejandro started off by saying that climate crisis is a public health crisis. At Amnesty, we say the climate crisis is a human rights crisis, right? And within that, we have the right to health, we have the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and we have the rights to all of the things that we describe as the social determinants of health, the right to housing, the right to food, et cetera. So all of those are threatened by climate change, either directly or indirectly. And as a human rights organization, in addition to the social determinants, we also look at civil and political rights and how indivisible those are from economic, social, and cultural rights, and how key they may be to demanding that governments take action on climate change. So, for example, there needs to be freedom of expression, freedom of association, access to information in a format that people can understand and process and use in order to monitor government action, to demand that their government do better, to assess what's happening and describe what's going on. So we need only to look outside today to see what's happening here. COP is being held in a country where protest is criminalized. So our colleagues at Human Rights Watch came out with a report a few days ago talking, noting that the population in the UAE on an annual basis is exposed to 8 times what the WHO recommends for particulate matter 2.5 micrometers or less. So that is a significant health threat. A lot of this is caused by fossil fuels, but there is no one here to make claims on the government. So we can see how all human rights are indivisible in terms of what we need to do to take climate action and to demand, to provide a framework for accountability for our governments to do better.
And so looking at the last days of COP, or looking at week 2 of COP, I think there's a real, I think the whole international community is now looking at whether we're gonna implement a fossil fuel phase out or not, or are we working on more adaptation or not. So I think those are themes that are very present in week 2. So if you look at those themes and then at a global health crisis that we have, what kind of recommendations would you have for the legislation, well, for negotiators, for policymakers within the UNFCCC system?
I mean, our official asks for this COP are a commitment to phase out, not phase down, all fossil fuels, so not this abatement, which is not really a thing. All fossil fuels are bad, and to demand that historic emitters and high-income countries in a position to do so contribute what they've already committed to climate finance for adaptation, some of which would go to health systems in affected countries, right, who are on the front lines of the climate crisis and who contributed very little. I think at the same time, within the negotiating process, we can also find some gaps in ability for different constituencies to participate, and this may play a role in who's at the table and who has the ability to influence the negotiations. So on the one hand, there have been issues with having adequate tickets for various constituency, folks who maybe felt ill at ease about coming to this country and to other places where COP has been held in the past. And we have 2,456 fossil fuel lobbyists here. So I think it's really essential that the health community stand up and call out fossil fuels as the key driver of climate change. We saw with this ministerial declaration that they did not explicitly mention fossil fuels. So naming the cause of the human rights crisis is also key to solving it.
Okay, thank you. And Cecilia, you are more also looking at cities and the nearest well-being or the nearest environments that people might have and where they actually live in. So from a more city perspective, how do you look at the human rights nexus within global health and climate change, and how would you, from a city perspective, also prevent the negative consequences of air pollution?
No, thanks. That's a very difficult question, actually. But no, we work very closely with local governments, just like you're saying. So national governments do the policy, and the implementation actually takes place on the local level. So supporting local governments and actually understanding what some of those policies are, but also actually building the bridge between communities and for local governments to understand the needs of the communities and involving them in some of those decision-making processes that you were talking about and being able to implement that. So for example, we actually support cities in developing strategies around, for example, public space, so green public spaces. How do we actually expand the amount of space that is allocated to green spaces? And we've also seen that there's such inequalities within cities. So it's not only taking into consideration about involving different communities, like, for example, youth or women or persons with disabilities, but you really need to go down onto the ground and work in informal communities, because they are the ones that are actually the most susceptible to air pollution. And it's really been very difficult to involve them because they often don't sit in the same platforms as we do. So, it's really important to be down in the communities directly, working with them to understand what their needs are, raise awareness, but also raise their voices in some of these negotiations. I'm not so sure how it's actually being done here. I've seen there's a lot of indigenous communities, the women's communities, there's the slum dwellers are also here. And I think these are really important spaces for them to be, but even more important is for them to be on the local level and raising these issues.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And I think also the point Rebecca raised about access to information really counts for this point as well. And I was wondering, besides more access to information, for example, what is still needed within the current system to raise awareness about this topic within cities or within local communities?
Well, I actually think the most important thing is actually to capacity build local government to understand how to engage communities. I think they often feel a little bit scared and maybe intimidated in actually going down into local communities. So it's actually trying to bridge that gap in bringing those voices of communities into local government processes, to be able to develop those processes and those strategies for them to actually reduce air pollution. But not only that, I think it's also actually involving them. I'm an urban planner, so maybe I'm a little bit biased on that front, but it's also about engaging communities in planning their cities, in planning their neighborhoods. So, being able to be part of that, engage in it, and so it's really that, providing those opportunities to have that dialogue, to be engaged. I mean, one of the things that we have been doing, because we found reaching out to youth is not very easy, and so we've actually been using Minecraft as a way to engage young people and children in actually, for example, designing their neighborhood. And, it's really fantastic to see how they take the power and are able to actually stand in front of the mayor and present their ideas through Minecraft. So I think it's just finding those tools, innovative tools of actually bringing people together.
Okay, very well. And well, you're using Minecraft. Rebecca, your organization is called Women Engagement for a Common Future. So how do you engage women or other marginalized groups or communities within this topic?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it exactly ties into what you said about bringing these sort of local solutions to the global stage, and then how do you do that? So part of what we do is we organize the Gender Just Climate Solutions Awards. I always carry the publication here for exactly moments such as this. Let me see, without everything dropping out. But basically, we organize this every year that highlights local solutions from the ground. So we have 3 winners each year, so non-technical, technical, and transformative solutions. And really what we do is not, we give an award and we say that was it, bye. We have a mentoring program, we have capacity building trainings, like you mentioned, which is crucial. And it allows them to kind of translate what they do at a local level and why policymakers should put those sort of perspectives in their work. For example, when it comes to climate financing, that's a lot of money doesn't reach these sort of initiatives. And so what can this process help to kind of aid that? How can, in direct financing, smaller grants, of course, in the form of grants and not loans, that sort of thing. Those are the type of financing that these sort of initiatives are looking for. And it's just a very exciting sort of project. And it has really become like a very close-knit community where also all of these initiatives and winners of the past can also build on each other, are mentoring each other, are bringing each other around when some of them are, of course, new winners. And it's the biggest compliment I think we received this year, where some of our former winners took the stage and said, yeah, it truly feels like a family. So yeah, it's about that sort of community building, and in the Netherlands, for example, how we do that with youth is also bridging the gap between topics. So we are trying to engage young feminists on the topic of climate action and saying to climate activists, this feminist lens is also very, very useful for your type of work. So kind of bridging these two groups and merging them together and showing what sort of similarities they have in the sort of work that they do has been super interesting, and a way of kind of bringing them together, fighting for the same cause.
And with this experience, what would you advise policymakers to implement for future-proof policy tools, for instance? Because I think your organization is working like to contribute to capacity building, basically. And I think maybe from these experience, you have some recommendations that you would like to provide to policymakers to maybe change the policy tools that we currently have in the Netherlands to engage women and to engage indigenous communities or marginalized groups. So do you have an advice for policymakers to take into account if you want to improve the decision-making process, so to say?
I think a key thing is the first step is listening. So it's really talking to these local women, to indigenous people, and hearing it directly from the horse's mouth. So that's also why we find it so crucial that we have this dual action advocacy approach, where yes, we help partners to implement these projects, but then we also bring them here to do that advocating on their own behalf. So it's about hearing from them, what are those barriers that you find? What are these limitations? How can we best support? Because sometimes what we think in policymaking spaces might be useful for them actually is not. So listening to these voices and these initiatives in the first place, I think, is the most important thing. Plus, super inspiring. Every time I hear from one of our partners that we work with, it baffles me how much they already have this holistic approach in their way of working. Maybe I'll get into one example, just really briefly. One of the partners that we work with, Agnes, from Arue, which is Action for All Women's Empowerment in Uganda. She has this whole holistic approach of both empowering women to get into the green energy transition, so using solar panels, but also using, for example, Loretta stoves. So making sure that there's less pollution in the house, which is a super big issue. So not only outdoor pollution, but definitely indoor pollution is something that women and girls and children in general are disproportionately affected by. And so this is a solution also, again, for biodiversity crisis and forest loss, because now that you have these type of stoves, you don't chop wood for it anymore. So if you look at all of these SDGs and the ones that she tackles in her work, it's a whole list of them. And I think we can learn from examples like Agnes's work, which is that you can't separate these issues. They are interlinked and they require a different sort of thinking and again, a holistic approach.
Okay, very well. And Marta, if you look from an Amnesty International perspective, and you would be asked to give policy recommendations as well to tackle the air pollution and to tackle the inequality problem where some groups are very much effective but not taking into account, what would you advise?
So when we look at air pollution or other manifestations of climate change, we look at the obligations of the country in which we're conducting research, as well as the obligations of other countries, right? So the air is a particular challenge because it's a public good. It's not confined to one country. It knows no borders. So our recommendations are often focused on the end result, which is clean air, rather than how to get there. But one thing we also emphasize a lot in our work are procedural rights, right? So these are the rights to participation, the rights to access to information, the right to free expression, the right to protest, and other elements that are essential for ensuring that those policy responses are non-discriminatory in their impact, that they take on board knowledge that Indigenous peoples, as well as other communities might have about protecting biodiversity, for example, and that they do not exacerbate, but in fact, to some extent, remedy inequalities that may exist within a particular society.
All right. And Well, Fabian, you have been listening to this conversation, and I think we are, actually looking for a change in policy and a change in the tools we use, because we need to make sure that everyone is included in the decision-making process, especially regarding the nexus of climate change and global health. So from your perspective, we know in the Netherlands we have this intergenerational test. So this test actually is still a bit like tested, so it's not formally implemented, but it tries to look at the the effects of current policies on future generations. And your organization has been quite active in this process, and you have been active in formulating how this should look like. So can you maybe, from your perspective at the Youth Climate Coalition, can you shed light on this intergenerational test, and also maybe provide other creative out-of-the-box ideas that we should advise policymakers to really tackle the problem of air pollution, or at least tackle the global health consequences, or the negative consequences on global health due to climate change?
Yeah, thank you, first of all, Sarah, for having me here on stage, and very exciting to be here. Perhaps since we're a small group, to make it a little interactive, I would like to see some hands. Who of you live in a country that face issues related to air pollution? I see some hands. Well, I think everyone should raise their hand, right? Because just to show the gravity of the situation, as you already mentioned, and also some of the other panelists, according to WHO standards, only 99% of people, they live in a place where air pollution exceeds guidelines. So that's almost everyone in the world. So we really have a major issue. And I think there's multiple ways to address this. And I'm very curious, and also very like the examples that all of you gave. And especially you, Marta, you talked a little bit about the human rights approach. I have a very good friend from Costa Rica at home, and she always tells me that in the Costa Rican constitution, they have a right to a clean and healthy environment. And how this right actually enables people from Costa Rica to go to court and to demand from their local, regional, national governments that they should actually act and effectively do something about the problem. But of course, Sarah, you didn't ask me to talk about human rights, but about
you can if you want.
Future-proof policy tools. So in the Netherlands, I volunteer for an umbrella organization called the Youth Climate Coalition. We represent the voices of more than 60 organizations. And we've been advocating, I think I can say quite successfully, for a youth test to be included in when national but also local, regional governments make policies and laws, that they also look at the long-term effect of these policies. And I think that's what the issue is really about, right? So that not only governments, but also businesses, politicians, when they make choices, they don't only think about the short-term benefits, but also about the long-term effects on youth, but also future generations. And perhaps I can share a little bit more later if you want about...
You can share it now if
sure,
you want.
Yeah. So, well, exactly as you mentioned, we're still in the pilot phase now. But I think we already can see the successes, especially in the Netherlands. So there's different ways in which we implemented the test. If you look at the local level, for example, the municipality of Rotterdam, when they now think about spatial planning issues and want to issue a certain permit for a certain project, with this youth test, intergenerational equity test, however you want to call it, they have to think and take into account what will this permit, when I issue this permit, what will that mean on the long term? When I construct this building, think about the emission of fine particles. What will the effects be? And also on the national level, if you create a vision for mobility for 2040, what are we going to do with that huge amount of money, all these millions of euros? How are we going to invest them? Are we going to invest them in enlarging this highway, or are we, for example, putting a big part of that money aside to create more bike lanes? And I think if you use a youth test, now we can already see that policymakers think ahead, and they actually then say, well, maybe it's better to put more money into the bike lane and a little less into the highway.
Well, Cecilia, if you're listening to this and you're looking at cities, would this be something that should work from your perspective at UN Habitat? Do you think that this intergenerational testing works within policymaking?
Absolutely. I was actually really excited when you were talking about that, because I think that's really the crux of the matter, is actually having the youth to review and go through all the different policies and strategies, and I mean, really sort of local. And, but I think what also is required, I think, for decision makers is also having a little bit of data and understanding, you know, if I invest in this, this is what the benefits or the impact will be. If I invest in this, then this is what the impact and benefits will be. So being able to have that sort of a range of different options, and I think then, you know, having the voice of the youth actually come forward saying that, you know, this is specifically what we would like. We would like more cycle lanes. We want access to public transport. We want to have more green spaces, more play areas. I think, you know, that's sort of at that level, I think it would have a lot of impact actually, and I like that.
And to actually provide you with a bit more information on this topic, well, there are a lot of, well, not a lot of, but I think there are some critics that say that it's very hard to determine what kind of effects policies have on the future. Because I think a lot of young people are advocating for an intergenerational test that looks at the effects of policies within 30 to 40 years, for instance. But sometimes it's very hard to predict what kind of policies or what kind of influences policies have in such a long period of time. And the Japanese, for instance, they have this tool which is called the 7-generational thinking. And there they actually have two groups. So one group is in the present, and they represent the year we are in currently. And the other group represents 2060. So they are almost 35 years ahead of us. And then they have this simulation about certain topics which are important to their local communities, and they come up with various interesting solutions which the municipalities actually take really serious. So if you have this tool next to the intergenerational test, how would you compare those, and how would you, well, would you prefer maybe one over the other, or, well, what do you think of it?
No, I think it's very good to have a sort of a long-term planning perspective. That's very important. And I think we need to have that. We need to have a sort of a long-term vision as to where we would like to go, where we would like to be. But I do think that sometimes it gets a bit daunting when you talk about sort of 30, 40 years in the future. It feels like I don't have any say in how that is going to go. So I think it's really important to have that local level options to be able to show, for example, we've been doing quite a bit of work around placemaking. So doing sort of interventions, very low scale, on a sort of on the neighborhood level, but actually seeing how that has impacted on people's lives. For example, the walkability of streets. You know, closing some streets for walking for a certain period of time, and then you can actually monitor the air quality, see that it is actually reduced. So, you know, there's sort of some small, I think you need those small interventions to actually keep that momentum to, you know, keep your mind going forward into the future.
Yeah, and Fabian, what is your response on this local, well, these local activities, and how is the Youth Climate Coalition in the Netherlands working on or building upon those local initiatives?
Yeah, well, I can. It's very hard to predict the future, right? We don't have a ball and then you just say, okay, this is what it's going to be. And I think that should also not be the aim of such a youth test. I think rather it's to ensure that policymakers, they start thinking about the long-term processes, and then it can also be just a plus or a minus. So what we did in the Netherlands when we talked with ministries and consultancies, and we started actually developing the test, you know, and actually thinking what should it include. We decided to focus on, I believe, 5 different themes. So one of which is environment, so we also look at air pollution. Then another one is climate, another one is also the labor market, the economy, and then just to think through, like, okay, this particular policy, what would it mean in 15 years? Would it perhaps, well, increase jobs, or could it potentially decrease jobs? Would it perhaps stay the same? And just to have a bit more of an overview and to zoom out a little bit, and think what could it mean in the long term, but not, of course, you can never predict what it actually would do. But I think already by applying this test and by thinking about this, you can prevent that only short-term, mostly economic benefits are being taken into account, which is, I think, the most important thing.
Yes, definitely. And how do you engage with young people at the local level in the Netherlands?
Well, in very different ways. Our organization, we organize, for example, panel discussions where we ask young people what they think about certain policies. And then we go with this input, we go to policymakers and we tell them, hey, perhaps this or that. And if you talk about the youth test, there's always, well, usually policymakers conduct a type of an impact assessment or an environmental impact assessment. And we very much advocate for including young people in these types of processes and asking what they think, well, what the impact would be of plans. And I think that similar initiatives also, as you mentioned, in Japan, but also in Germany, Flanders, outside of Europe as well, exist. And that now really is the time to share these best practices. And I'm very happy what happens at the local level, the regional level, and national level. What I do still miss is these types of initiatives at multilateral fora. For example, at the European Union, the European Economic and Social Council has been quite happy, and they have announced that they want to include this, but the European Commission is still, it's still not included in the impact assessment. So I think there's still quite some potential there.
I think you just tackled the subject that I wanted to highlight, because we have now talked a bit about the national level, so what would we advise to policymakers, but we have talked also about the local level, so about the Minecraft game where young people or other groups can actually design their own future or their own environment that they would like to live in. But we haven't really talked about the international level yet. We have talked about a bit about the UNFCCC, but not about what the role should be of international organizations. So, Marta, what is your view on the role of international organization, and what kind of responsibility should they have to tackle global health problems that are caused by climate change, such as air pollution?
Well, they're comprised of member states. So the member states certainly have obligations that I think we all agree they're failing on. So I think one thing that we've been doing, you referenced the right to a healthy environment, is to think about how to further enshrine that right on the global level. So there's an effort, the UN General Assembly recognized this right in 2021. There's now an effort to enshrine it in the European Convention on Human Rights and advocacy effort. There are efforts to strengthen the jurisprudence from various regional bodies, right, including asking the International Court of Justice and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights to issue advisory opinions on state obligations with regard to climate change. So this would buttress the framework that we use at all levels, right, domestic, regional, and global, to point to more particularly what are state obligations. So you asked me earlier about how propositional we are, what kinds of guidance we provide with regard to policy. And I think some of what needs to happen is we have really good statements and reports from special rapporteurs and other actors within the human rights system, so reflecting their guidance in more binding decisions would help to strengthen the international human rights framework. There are also efforts that we're not involved in as well, for example, to make ecocide a crime under the Rome Statute. That's something that there are folks here pursuing that objective. I think at the same time, we need to look at, the processes that UNFCCC, WHO, all of these international organizations follow, the multilateral development banks. when it comes to decision making about participatory processes, as I've already discussed, transparency, conflict of interest, right? Who needs to declare when you're having a multilateral discussion, who's at the table, what rights do we have to know about who they are and what interests they're pursuing, and who should be excluded from the table. So WHO, for example, has very clear guidance that comes from the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control related to tobacco and alcohol interests in global health. They're not allowed to be present, and anyone is asked to disclose any interest they may have or any ties they may have to these industries. So the UNFCCC has new guidance that asked folks to disclose their affiliation, which is one reason why we know there are over 2,400 this year, and this is a huge increase over previous years. But this is in part because we have a larger group here, but also there's more transparency. So there are people representing those interests in the past who hadn't declared what they were. So I think making that conflict of interest policy even more robust, and then also talking about potentially criteria for who's hosting COP. Because we can look at the interests that are represented among the various governments with power and who are setting the agenda at different COP, the different iterations of COP, and what kind of speech is allowed within the blue zone space.
Very well. And in the beginning of your statement, you already mentioned the advisory opinion. So some colleagues of us from the Netherlands, they have worked very hard on this advisory opinion from their organization, Culture for Climate Justice.
Yes.
And they are currently also at COP to make sure that there are countries that are actually bringing the biggest problem of the world, which is climate change, to the court, because a country needs to formulate a case before the ICG can actually look into it. So from your perspective, what would your statement be for an advisory opinion, or what would your advice be for a country that needs to formulate such a thing?
Yeah, so that campaign was youth-led. We participated in it as sort of following the lead by the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change and all of the other youth organizations. I think that the World's Youth for Climate Justice Foundation came out with guidance. We've actually been using that guidance and sharing it with the amnesty sections and saying, please lobby your government, because we have amnesty sections all over the world, right? There's an Amnesty Netherlands, there's an Amnesty South Africa, and Amnesty USA, and asking them to use that handbook in writing letters to their government, urging them to make submissions that aren't as bad as they otherwise would be, right? Let's be honest. There are efforts to ensure that the countries most affected by climate change have the capacity to submit very robust documents, but also to try to ensure that historic emitters and wealthy countries don't try to subvert the rigor of the opinion or the robustness of the opinion by making claims about abatement or unabatement or fossil gas versus coal, or what the extraterritorial obligations of historic emitters are, right? The countries that are most responsible for climate change must act first and in the largest way to reduce their consumption, production of fossil fuels, and to provide funding for loss and damage and for adaptation. So we want to make sure that the submissions to the International Court of Justice support those demands rather than undermine them or make specious or rely on other types of legal arguments, but instead to forefront their human rights obligations.
Okay. And Rebecca, if you look at this topic, so the advisory opinion, what would you like for countries to take into account if they formulate a question for the ICG?
I think the word intersectionality comes to mind here. So it's not only about, for example, it's not only about youth, it's also about women and girls and all their diversity, and really finding the nexus of, okay, where does policy work for a certain group and where does it not work for the other, and why that is, sort of thing. So, for example, sometimes things are implemented with the best of intentions, right? You have, let's say, an issue of not enough toilets where women and girls needs, right? You build that toilet, you think, great, we're done. Then they don't use it because turns out it's not well lit, so they don't feel safe using it. So also doing that sort of test afterwards of, okay, did it actually have the impact for the groups that I wanted to reach? Or did it not do that? And then kind of going back to the drawing board. And to kind of avoid that cycle, to begin with, first step should be to just consult all of these different groups and gather the data. So not only who would it be useful for, but also asking them, what would be useful for you at this moment in time? Sometimes you might also think, okay, this is what you might need. And they say, yes, we do. But for me, this is #1 priority right now. So that, again, comes back to, I think, asking the right people, gathering that data, and making informed decisions based on this intersectional data that is too often lacking. And thankfully, at the COP this year, there was a gender and data, environmental data conference right before COP. So it was also definitely like put on the agenda here that this is something super important if we want to make climate policy work for the largest amount of people.
And do you also believe then in that we sometimes have to treat the situation unequal to create equality?
What do you mean by that?
So there are some people that mention that we have to treat inequality by treating it in the beginning unequal to create equality. So for instance, sometimes you have to have a panel with only women just to create equality for both women and men.
Right.
And do you believe in such, or do you believe that we should all be together equal from the beginning onwards?
That's a super interesting one because I changed my opinion on this like after working for my organization for a bit. So when it comes to positive discrimination, for example, I always was of the opinion like, no, I will just fight for my role, and as a woman, if I don't get there, then I'll just work 4 times as hard, blah, blah, blah. So I really had that mindset before, and then through working in my organization, I came to discover, yeah, that's just kind of not how it works. If somebody isn't the first and isn't put there in the first place, it just doesn't happen, right? So for example, on boards, you have this example where when it's usually men in those sort of positions, they tend to then hire somebody that kind of looks like them. That's just a sort of bias that you have. So if you've never seen a woman, for example, in that sort of space, it's very, very hard to make that happen. So I'm more in favor now than I used to be of yes, putting people in spaces where normally they would have to fight super hard to get into. We should lend them a hand, and in order to indeed, at some point, hopefully in the future, but it's still very, very long away, to just have that happen organically and not have to think about it. Of course, that would be the dream, but the reality is that we need this at the moment for now.
We need more activism on this.
Of course.
We were talking about the advise your opinion a bit, and I know that in the Netherlands, but also recently in Portugal, we had some court cases for climate change, or not for climate change, but against climate change and for climate justice. And I actually want to give Cecilia and Bo Fabian the floor to elaborate on your views when it comes to court cases, because I know there are some pros and some cons for this. I personally believe that court cases are quite well to make sure that our decision-making processes actually deliver on what they are aiming for, and if they're lagging behind, we should remind them via our right-based systems that we should help them accountable. But Cecilia, what is your view on these rising court cases?
I'm actually no expert in this area, but if I look at it from a personal point of view, then I would actually say that it is important to raise these issues. It is important to actually have redress for situations where you actually do feel that you are entitled to it. I do think that is very important. Now I'm talking from a personal perspective. I think that especially when you get to the local level, maybe, because I think that is really an area where, as an individual, it's very difficult to actually bring up some of these cases. So, to be able to have support to do that, I think is really important, to actually understand where to go, to get redress. And often it's very difficult, I think. for people to understand where to go.
Yeah.
And especially in communities, I think that might be the most affected. They don't have any knowledge or information of where to go, maybe. So.
Okay. And well, leaving the court a bit behind, how do you influence politics from UN Habitat?
Well, we actually have a sort of a multi-governance approach, let's put it that way. So of course, as UN Habitat, we're governed by member states, so they actually take decisions on our work plan, on our budget, and actually on our sort of focus as we go forward, sort of bringing up some of those priority areas. And I think, so we have our member states, but then we also work very closely with local governments. So it's really about working with local governments, with communities, in actually trying to make those changes and to bring those voices up to the member states as well, to the national government. So I think it's a little bit of a dual process of actually working. And I think that's maybe the beauty of sometimes working in the UN, is that you have that opportunity to try and bring these voices together. For us as well, I think it's important to have sort of the national policies, but then and policy guidance. But then I think actually on the local level there needs to be some sort of they need to be able to actually implement those policies and have the resources, the mandate, and the capacity to actually be able to implement some of those policies. So I would actually maybe leave it at that.
Okay. And Fabian, how do you influence politics? Do you like the court cases, or do you advocate in a different way?
Well, about the court cases, I think I can say only something very much from my own perspective.
Sure, yeah.
I know that my capacity as volunteer for the Youth Climate Coalition, because we do not have a formal standpoint on that. I think we have to be very careful. I think there's a lot of positive effects, but there can also be some downsides that might sometimes be overlooked. When you talk about court cases, it's very broad, right? So you have cases related to climate, but you also have cases related to pollution, cases against businesses, cases against states. And I think it's sometimes hard because if you have a case against the state, let's say the Agenda case, quite a famous Dutch climate case, it's very hard because as a judge, of course, you do not have all the tools that policymakers have to effectively address issues such as climate change, which are very complex. And I think if you look at the outcome of the Agenda case and what followed in the Netherlands, is that we see that Dutch emissions dropped and they actually reached 20% reduction that was ordered by the court. But I think it's debatable whether this was due to the judgment, because then it was the COVID and we had a pandemic. But if you look at the judgment, the effects of that, there's also another case right after, in which a Dutch district court ordered a recycling facility to move abroad to Ireland because of the outcome of the case. They said, well, reductions, we have to reduce our global emissions. So what happened is that it moved back to Ireland. But in Ireland, they did not recycle the waste, but they just put it in the ground, they landfill. So actually, if you look at a global perspective, this resulted in higher emissions. So you can question, is this good, right? Because it's not in the Netherlands anymore, these emissions, we dropped, but in Ireland, the emissions went up. Because in the Netherlands, we recycled it in a way, we burned the waste and we used the heat to heat our houses. So I think you have, yeah, it's very complex, these court cases. And I think my personal take would be that in cases which involve states might be difficult. Cases involving businesses might be more effective, because when we talk about a business, you can really, well, if you say you have to reduce your emissions, they can really just like change their policies in a much easier way.
All right. Well, thank you all for the contributions, and you're not done yet, but I actually want to also look at the audience to maybe if there's a question for one of the panelists. Yeah, I see Kiki. Maybe you can come to the floor and then you can ask your question.
I'll start by saying I truly wish we weren't doing talking about this. I had a question about
Use the microphone.
I had a question about the global perspective that we need to look at, because Marta, you mentioned that clean air is, how it's called, it's a public good, and that makes it really difficult to make effective policies. And also, Fabian, you said that it's really difficult to have effective policies because, for instance, with the Urgenda case, maybe in the Netherlands the emissions were reduced, but in Ireland they went up. So how can we tackle this problem?
Maybe Marta first, and then Fabian, maybe?
I mean, I think there are multiple answers and you can't be perfect, right? I think one way to tackle the problem is global solidarity and organizing, right? So we're asking for the same things in different places and trust that in the medium term, we're moving the needle in the same direction, even if there are setbacks. I think you can have global level norms, standards, and commitments that kind of bind everyone, including international human rights law, but any other environmental law or decision that comes out of the International Court of Justice, for example, that would bind everyone or move everyone towards enacting the same commitments. I also think it's important that the argument that there are different standards in different places is a complicated one because sometimes it's used to delay progress, right? So you have some countries which have fewer emissions in their production of fossil fuels, which say we shouldn't be asked to phase them out because we're doing it in a more responsible way than some other country that's producing them, and they're violating labor rights and they have more scope 1 and more scope 2, like more emissions associated with their operations. So that may be true, but it's also an argument that enables inaction, and I would push back on it for that reason. It also, of course, relates to the income and the historic emissions of the countries at issue. And the obligations are that the country using this argument needs to act first. So I think those are some of my thoughts, and I think the last one is anytime you're engaging in strategic litigation, you try to game out, right? Which court this is in, are we going to win, is it the right time politically, what's it going to mean in other jurisdictions, and all we can do is try our best. People,
right.
Yeah.
Fabian, did you also want to comment on this?
I think I can only agree very much with what Marta just said. And yeah, here we're at COP, so it needs to happen here, especially in the coming days. So I'm positive, but also not. So let's see what happens. And
Rebecca, maybe from a gender perspective, like looking at the global partnerships and global perspectives on the transnational problems that air pollution also brings along, what would you advise from a gender perspective?
From a gender perspective, I think it's a global issue, right? Like the regression on gender equality and women's rights. It's quite a dangerous trend, I would say. So also keeping that in mind when making policies, every time that you leave the word gender behind or it's scratched out, you're scratching out half of the population. That is kind of what these policies are meant for. So I would say on a global stage, it's crucial that we're mindful of the different groups and how they are affected differently, and some of them are affected disproportionately. A one-size-fits-all solution doesn't fit anybody. So I think that is what I would like to say on that.
Okay. Well, we're coming almost to the end of the side event. And but before we finish, I actually wanted to ask all the panelists, starting with Cecilia, to give one key action point for the rest of COP that we should all take into account. So if you could name one thing that should really be put on the agenda and that we should really look at still during COP until Tuesday, what would that be?
I actually think that the most important thing is actually taking into consideration the global south, because I think they are the ones that are actually feeling the impacts of climate change a lot, and I think their voices are being heard, but not as much as it should. So I think it's actually the global south, but I also think more than just the global south, I actually think it is the poor. So, poor communities are the ones that actually need to benefit, and they need to sort of, I think the voices of the poor, I think we should just put the poor forward in the negotiations somehow.
Yeah, I think we also see that, right, with regard to air pollution, the poorest people or the people that don't really have that much money to provide, for instance, a better housing environment, they end up living near highways, for instance, and they breathe polluted air. So I think you make a very good point there. Marta, what would your point be?
I would say that everyone here should be a climate activist. Don't be afraid, push your governments, be intersectional, think about who's affected the most, how the indivisibility of human rights, as well as the importance of different identities and what that means for how people experience climate injustice, what it means for what their governments are able to negotiate, and to demand that your governments do better.
Okay, and Rebecca?
Yeah, I'll go for a similar one in that I think that everybody should be a feminist in this fight, which is really, really similar to me. Like being a feminist is fighting for climate justice, is fighting for everybody's health, is fighting for human rights, is using that intersectional approach. Otherwise, for me, it's not feminist. So putting on that gender lens, the feminist glasses, I think is what I would like to say.
Okay, and Fabio?
I think for me it would be fossil fuel phase out, because I think that's the only way in which we can secure really a 1.5 degree world and secure a clean and healthy environment for all of us and for the future.
Okay, well, I hope everybody took note of that. Thank you very much. I want to ask you to remain seated for 5 seconds, because then we can finish the live stream, and then people don't see you moving, that they are watching online. So thank you all so much for this discussion. I think we had a very fruitful discussion, and we had a lot of very interesting lines and very interesting perspectives. And I think we mentioned a lot of things. We mentioned local action, we mentioned national action, but also international perspectives on air pollution and the nexus of human rights and global health and all the consequences that are caused by climate change. So thank you all for this, and I hope we can keep up the collaboration on this topic. And yeah, by this I want to end this panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.